So I'm here with one of our software developers, Jon Maron, and today you're going to be talking about Open API, AI, and I think one other acronym.
MCP,
All right.
Model Context Protocol. So OpenAPI is a standard. It's it used to be called Swagger.
Swagger?
It used to be called Swagger, and it
Okay.
was a way of describing REST APIs. So it was just a way to describe the request structures, the response structures, the authentication mechanisms, just to give you a sort of a comprehensive understanding of what that REST API would do. What we're doing is currently we have our API descriptions published on the website. We're extending that to include the Open API specifications. The nice thing about that is historically it's been used to sort of do rapid development, to enable rapid development, because the spec would allow you to use tools to sort of generate, you could generate like server skeletons, which were sort of the skeletal framework for creating a server. So all the hard stuff is taken away from you. You focus on business logic. You just fill in the business logic to these generated skeletons. And similarly on the client side, you could generate the stubs and just invoke those stubs. All the hard stuff in terms of setting up the HTTP requests and setting up what are my parameters, what are my headers, all that stuff is sort of hidden from you, and you just sort of interact with the API. So it made development much easier. And that is going to be further sort of enhanced or utilized, I guess, in the AI world. Like we're going to be able to use these specifications. First of all, clients could use them because it's a really sort of easily well formatted representation of the APIs. So an AI client can read that information and basically understand fully how it needs to interact with that API. So it's going to enable people who are sort of creating AI-based applications to very easily interact with our API. For us, it's also going to enable potentially development of sort of AI resources, and that's where those MCPs come into play. MCPs are servers that you can deploy that allow AI clients to sort of interact with with some sort of resource. In our case, it's our API. So we can expose our API via MCP servers, and that way people can utilize their chat clients, Chat GPT, Claude Desktop, to find out a whole bunch of information about races and just through a natural sort of conversation in a chat. So the APIs are just the methods that we expose. So we expose an API, for example, called GetRace. And when you just need to feed it a couple parameters, like the race ID and stuff like that. And it'll return a whole bunch of information. It's like a long document that it returns, a JSON document. And it has information like the race associated events and the race name and the location and what giveaways are available, stuff like that. It has all the information associated with the race, and then just a big long document that it returns about the race. So in our case, what we're going to do is the nice thing about OpenAPI is it's very well structured. You sort of understand it. You have and sort of an a priori knowledge of how to interact with an Open API specification. So we can create sort of a generic client that can invoke any API. We can then call that client from these tools that are going to be part of the MCP server that we'll create. And that is what's exposed to the AI clients. So for example, an AI client will go, I'm interested in Scott's Coffee, right? The events associated with Scott's Coffee race. And that request goes off. The client understands that I'm asking about a race, so it knows that it has a MCP server that knows about races. So it'll structure the request and send it off to that MCP server, which will then execute our Open API client, which will structure the request, send it off to our API, get the information back, and return it back. So it's like exposing all this information to an AI LLM that wasn't there. For example, I guess like in most cases, the LLMs are doing things like going out and, crawling the web and gathering information and using all that information to sort of understand the world. And what we're doing is we're adding our API to that information that it can gather. So it just is able to go off and find out a lot of information about races, more detailed information that would probably be exposed through our website. You just get all this information returned directly from the API.
Now, can you describe a little bit more about what an MCP is?
Sure. So there's a lot of base terminology that they use right now with MCP. So you have an MCP server, and that's sort of a server that's running somewhere that probably either exposes an endpoint or can be invoked directly some other way. But it is sort of a server that fronts some sort of resource or a set of resources. So in our case, the MCP server would front our APIs. Would be some like effectively like a middleware between us and the APIs. And then there's within an MCP server, they talk about tools, and a tool is just a function running within that MCP server. In our case, a tool probably represents an interaction with a given API or gathering up, invoking an API and getting specific information out of that API and returning it. It just sits out there as something that the AIs can query. And on your client side, currently what you have to do is you generally, if you look at like Claude Desktop or ChatGPT, they have through their settings the ability to sort of say, I want to add this MCP server to the sort of list of integrations or things that I can query. And then, so you'd go through the process of adding that MCP server, and then you could start asking all these questions about, in our case, races and ticketable events and stuff like that. So that's the basic interaction that you end up with. In our case, it's going to be a nice extensible. Well, we're going to try to come up with something sort of extensible that allows us to sort of add these functions, modify the sort of responses that you get and stuff like that, and potentially represent all that through the Open API specifications that we published. And that's sort of the tie-in between the two, between Open API and MCP. It's like Open API is sort of a technology that will enable, hopefully, very fast development and modifications to the MCP server that will allow us to expose more and more information as we go along to AI clients.
Now, what are the advantages of this work for RunSignup users?
So from their perspective, I can give an example. So the chatbots are very good about gathering up information, using natural language to sort of understand what the user wants to know and sort of pulling that all together and forming an answer, right? So let's take a race in this case. If we have a RunSignup MCP running and one of its function is get race pricing, for example, from a chat bot, you're somebody who's looking for a race. You only have a certain amount of money and you're trying to find out if that race looks interesting, but can I actually afford any of the events that are associated with that race? So from the chat bot, you go, well, I'm interested in this race, but what can I do? Are there any events that I can participate in that are, less than $25? So then it'll go off, it'll query the MCP, it'll get the information back, it'll understand that I asked about a certain level of amount, it'll get all the pricing information from the natural language processing capabilities. It understands that I wanted to know about, events that are below a certain level, pricing level, and it can pull all that information and go, oh yeah, there's 3 events you can use or you can participate in if you only have $25 or something like that. So it makes the sort of searches that I think users would generally do in terms of like trying to find which race they want to participate in a lot easier and a lot more natural. It's not like this sort of Google search that returns a lot of information and then you start clicking on links. You sort of bypass all that and just get the information directly from just a very natural sort of language query.
And that GetRace, is that just pulling in one race's events?
In this example, yes, it's one race. But, if you expand that to sort of say, find me all the races in the area that within this distance that have priced events below a certain level, below a certain amount of money. That would be, yes, just another function that we expose that's more about getting a list of races opposed to getting a one race. So,
Okay.
and that again, the chat and on the client side, the chat understands from the language processing capabilities that it has that you're asking about multiple races instead of one race, and it'll sort of format its request like that, and that'll get sent to the MCP server. The one thing I haven't mentioned about MCP servers is, in addition to sort of this request response capability, it also returns sort of this metadata, this information about here are the functions I expose. If you want to invoke this function, here are the parameters you have to pass me and stuff like that, so that the client knows how to send it requests. So in this case, it would be sending, instead of a GetRace request or GetRace information request, it would send GetRace's request. And the MCP would return a list of races, and then a lot of this sort of the processing actually occurs within the LLM and the AI client, because it knows things like he asked about a certain amount of money, he said less than, it knows how to process the information that it got back and present it to the user. Think of it as when you have a client, like when you're just searching the web, you're just sort of blasting out and getting a bunch of information back. And the information is generally web pages, right? In this case, you're expanding it to also include our API. Like you're directly invoking our API to get the responses back.